Hey, welcome back. In the last video, we saw how for loops could make our lives easier by initializing the values of member variables in each element of an array. We're going to take that to the next level in this video. By using a for loop to update our animation frames for each nebula, update the nebula positions, and draw each nebula as well. Let's get started. Now here we're using a for loop to initialize the member variables of each element in the nebulae array. Now we're manually initializing the pos.x variables in each anim data in the nebulae array. But we can use a for loop to automate some of the other stuff we're doing as well. Let's scroll down to where we're updating the animation frames. Now here we're updating the animation frame for nebulae of 0. And just below it, we're updating the animation frame for nebulae of 1. Now, as I've said before, copied code like this is a prime opportunity to make use of a for loop. So why don't we create a for loop here? Just above our update nebula animation frame code, I'm going to create a for loop. And for the loop variable, we're going to initialize an int called I and initialize it to 0, just like we did before. Now for my loop condition, I could say I is less than 3, but what happens if we add more elements to our nebulae array? Suddenly we'd have to find each for loop and change this 3, and that could be very error prone because we might miss one. So instead of 3, I'd like to create a const variable for the number of elements in our array. Let's scroll back up to where we have our nebulae array. And just above it, we'll create a const int. And we'll call this size of nebulae. And we'll initialize it to 3. Now, instead of 3, we're going to use size of nebulae here in the array. And for our for loop, we're going to use size of nebulae instead of 3. Now, whenever we add elements to the array, all we need to do is change size of nebulae, and we'll use size of nebulae in every single for loop that we use to iterate through this array. And that includes the for loop that we're just about to create down here. So for this for loop, our loop condition will be I is less than size of nebulae. Now, for the update, we're going to use I++, just like our first for loop. Now for the code in the body. Well, we just need to use the code here for updating the nebula animation frame, so let's copy that and paste it in right here. We can highlight the code that didn't indent and hit tab. Now in this for loop, we want to use nebulae of I, and that way each iteration of the for loop I will update and will access a different element in the array. So I'm going to go to Edit and Replace. For the first text box, I'm going to type nebulae of 0. And for the replace, I'm going to type nebulae of I. Now I'm going to click Replace, and now this first nebulae of 0 in my for loop is changed to nebulae of I. Let's go ahead and keep clicking Replace to replace each of these instances in the for loop. Now my for loop looks great, and this loop is going to loop over every single element in my nebulae array and update its animation frame, which means I no longer need this code where I'm updating the first element, so I'm going to delete that. And I also no longer need the second bit of code where I update the second element, so I'm going to delete that as well. So that takes care of updating the animation frame. Now let's find the code where we're updating the nebulae position. We're going to need to scroll up, and we'll see it here where it says Update Nebula Position, and we're updating the pos.x on the first element of the array, and then just below it, we're updating the pos.x for the second element in the array. So just above it, create a for loop. Go ahead and type it out with the 3 statements initializing the loop variable, creating the loop condition, and the loop update. Excellent job. We're going to say for int I equals 0, I is less than size of nebulae, and I++. Now inside of our for loop, what are we going to put here so that we can update the pos.x for each element in the array? Well, we could just easily copy this line here where we're updating the nebula position, pasting it here, and changing the index to I. And now we no longer need to update each position manually, so I'm going to delete these lines of code. Now, inside the for loop, I can add a comment and say, update the position of each nebula. So that takes care of updating the positions. And finally, we need to take care of drawing the texture. So let's scroll all the way down to where we're calling draw texture rec. And here again, we see repeated code, another opportunity for a for loop. So go ahead and create another for loop and call draw texture rec in this for loop. Excellent job. We're going to say for int I equals 0, I is less than size of nebulae, and I++ for the loop update. And all we need to do in this loop is call draw texture rec. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this line along with its comment here. And I'm just going to replace nebulae of 0 with nebulae of I for both instances here. And now I can delete the draw texture rec calls for both nebula hazards as our for loop is doing it for us. Excellent job. So here's your challenge. Change size of nebulae to 6 so we have 6 nebulae instead of 3. Now for each element, I want you to set the pos.x equal to window dimensions plus some multiple of 300. The pos.x for each nebula hazard will be 300 more than the previous one. Now, bonus points if you could figure out how to do this in the for loop. Pause the video and give this a try. So here's size of nebulae, and we're going to set this from 3 to 6, which means we need to set pos.x for the 3 new elements. So why don't we copy these 3 lines and just paste them down below and change the index for each. So here we're going to change this one to 3, we'll change the next one to 4, and the next one to 5. Now for nebulae of 3.pos.x, we'll set it to window dimensions of 0 plus 900. And for 4, it'll be 1200, and for 5, it'll be 1500. All right, let's go ahead and hit run and start debugging. And there's the first nebula, there's the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, and our 6th and final nebula. Now, I said you'd get bonus points if you could figure out how to do this in the for loop instead of setting the pos.x manually. Well, notice that each nebula pos.x is 300 more than the previous one. So we could take advantage of this pattern. Here in the for loop, let's set nebulae of I.pos.x. And we'll set it equal to window dimensions of 0 plus some value. Can you think of what it is? It's going to be I times 300. When I is 0, pos.x will be set to window dimensions plus 0. When it's 1, pos.x will be window dimensions of 0 plus 300, and so on. So we can now delete these lines of code below the for loop, and now that we're setting pos.x in our for loop along with everything else, we're now no longer setting any values manually, which means that we could use any number and size of nebulae that we want. For example, let's put a 10 in here and just hit run and start debugging and see if we can count 10 nebula hazards. There's the first one. There's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So in summary, we used a for loop to update the animation frames of the nebula hazards, to update the nebula positions, and to draw the textures of the nebula hazards. This allowed us to create more hazards easily. In fact, it's as easy as changing our const int size of nebulae, because everything is handled automatically with the use of for loops. We now have a lot less repetitive code, a lot less copying and pasting, and our code is much more powerful. This is an excellent milestone, and you now have a tool in your tool belt essential to being a good programmer. See you in the next video.